back, warriors. Kwe, Tansei, Sego. My name is Pam Palmater, and this is my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us protect our people and the planet. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a very important issue. It's the recent decision, or I should say many decisions, of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which has found Canada guilty of racially discriminating against First Nations children in foster care. So stay tuned. Today, I'm talking to you about the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision to order compensation for First Nations children in foster care because of ongoing racial discrimination by the federal government. In fact, their most recent decision said it was willful and reckless and ongoing. But it's important to know the facts and the timeline because there's lots of noise on social media, there's lots of speaking points by politicians, which is very misleading. And so what I did is I went to the website of the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society and I collected as much information as I could to put in summary form for you in this video. And what I'll do is I'll actually post a link to their website in the description box below so that you can go there and benefit from all of the information that they have about the case, about the issues, and many ways that you can help. In 2007, the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society filed a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission alleging that the inequitable funding for First Nations kids in care was essentially discriminatory and wanted the Canadian Human Rights Commission to investigate. A year later, in 2008, the Canadian Human Rights Commission referred the complaint onto the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, where Canada immediately moved to dismiss the case. Now, in the beginning, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which is the decision-making body for the Canadian Human Rights Commission, agreed with Canada, dismissed the case on a legal technicality. However, the federal court overturned that decision and said that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal had to hear the case, but they reconstituted the people who would be sitting on the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Then many years go by and finally it's 2016 and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal finds that Canada is indeed guilty of racial discrimination against First Nations children in care for their chronic and purposeful underfunding of key preventative services. And we know from Canada's own documentation and own analysis that one of the root causes of the gross overrepresentation of First Nations kids in foster care is because of Canada's underfunding of critical preventative services and family services. Included in their decision was the fact that Canada failed to properly implement Jordan's Principle. And for those of you who don't know what Jordan's Principle is, it's named after Jordan River Anderson, a sweet little boy who had multiple medical issues and who needed extra medical care and aids in order to be able to live at home. But during his lifespan, the federal and provincial governments kept arguing over who had jurisdiction and responsibility to pay, and so he passed away sadly without ever being able to go home. So the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and many other First Nations activists and leaders pushed the government to come up with a principle where First Nations kids would never fall through the cracks. And in fact, they would be able to receive health services regardless of which point they made first contact, whether it was the federal government or the provincial government. And the federal and provincial governments could work out who would pay for that later. And the purpose of that is so that there would be no more situations like what happened to Jordan River Anderson and him passing away without ever being able to go home simply because of government fighting over jurisdiction. So this win in 2016 at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which found Canada guilty, was in fact a huge win. It's something that we knew for a long time. We know that the federal government discriminates against First Nations in general in terms of their own social programs and services, but it has been a particular problem with regards to First Nations children in foster care because it leads to increasing numbers of kids in foster care, millions of nights away from home and their parents and their communities, and a detachment from their language and culture. And we also know that statistically, First Nations children don't fare well in foster care and in forced adoptions. So this case in 2016 from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal was a huge win. It validated what we knew all along, that Canada has been racially discriminating, and we thought, or at least hoped, that there would be an immediate implementation of the orders of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to end the discrimination against our kids. Despite this decision being way back in 2016, Canada has yet to fully comply with the order of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, so that we are now in a situation where the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has had to issue not one, not two, not three, but 8 non-compliance orders against Canada. I mean, that is a pretty bitter and brutal irony for Canada, who is the first to tout the rule of law when they get a decision from the court that, like say an injunction which is trying to stop a community or First Nation from defending their lands and waters. They will send in the RCMP on the strength of that court order. But here we have the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal set up under Canadians law, Canadian provisions, and they won't even follow it. So we're in a situation where the non-compliance orders continue to pile up because Canada won't follow its own rule of law. And what does that mean? What it means in practical terms is that Canada has decided that it's worth it, that it is a valid policy objective to continue to fight some of the most vulnerable people in our society, First Nations children in foster care. You literally couldn't get any lower than that. And my question is, where is the RCMP? If this was a judicial order against a First Nation for defending their water from pipelines or contamination, they would be in there doing arrests and breaking up the scene. But we're talking about the loss of children's lives, the loss of children's opportunities, Canada's purposeful failure to abide by its own laws over and over and over again. Where is the RCMP in this scenario? However, this hasn't discouraged First Nations children, or the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society from continuing to push Canada to fulfill the law, basic human rights for First Nations children in care. And we've had another success. Just this September, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found Canada to be non-compliant again and ordered compensation for all of those impacted by Canada's purposeful, ongoing, reckless, and willful racial discrimination against First Nations children in care. They ordered compensation in the amount of $40,000 per person. Now, what that works out to is the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has certain set limits of the kind of compensation it can order. So for being a victim of racial discrimination, they can award up to $20,000 per person, and that's what they did. They ordered the max. And then there's also a provision where if the discrimination is knowing and purposeful, ongoing, reckless, willful, then they can also order another up to $20,000 per person for a total of $40,000. And because Canada has been ongoing in this scenario, it hasn't ended the discrimination, it hasn't fully complied with the order, and it would appear that that's why the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal issued the maximum possible compensation order that it could under its own provisions. And I'll also post a link to that decision below in the description box for you so that you can read it yourself. But if you refer to paragraph 234, it says this: Canada's conduct was willful and reckless, resulting in what we have referred to as a worst case scenario under our Act. And the act that they're talking about here is the Canadian Human Rights Act, and trying to prevent racial and other kinds of discrimination against people. And Canada's actions has been the worst case scenario that they could imagine under the Act. And it's also important to note the facts here. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal didn't order immediate payment. They gave the parties lots of time in order to come together and negotiate and come up with a plan on how the compensation would be distributed. However, Canada refused to meet. The First Nations Child and Family Caring Society was always ready, willing, and able to discuss this, but Canada wouldn't come to the table. Instead, what Canada decided to do was file a judicial review, in other words, an appeal, of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's decision. I mean, imagine that. They have been in non-compliance for order after order after order. It's years since the original decision was made, and now they want to provide a judicial review and try to appeal the decision altogether. It's hard to fathom. Canada is literally one of the wealthiest and most powerful countries in the world because of treaties with Indigenous peoples, because of the lands and resources that they stole, and now they would presume to deny even the basic programs and services to First Nations and children in care like other Canadian children. And what makes it even worse is what they're saying in the media. On the one hand, they're out in the public saying, oh yes, we accept that compensation is due to these victims, you know, the victims of our racial discrimination. But then on the other hand, they're in court saying, no, we don't think compensation is due. We want a review of this. We want the decision to be stayed. And in fact, they have started another proceeding saying that they actually want the decision to be quashed altogether, which means just totally overturned. So Canada went to the federal court and asked for a stay of the decision, which is a delay so that they don't have to implement it right away, if at all, because I already mentioned they have this other proceeding trying to quash the decision. Yet justice is on our side because the federal court denied Canada's application to stay the compensation order. That's right, you were denied, Canada, because you are not abiding by your own rule of law, and you should be ashamed of your actions in this case. And while this is yet another victory for First Nation kids in care and their families and their communities, it should be kept in mind that Canada does have this other legal proceeding which is making its way through the courts where it's going to try to quash the decision altogether. So it is incumbent on us to stay vigilant, to keep abreast of all of the facts, to make sure that we know what are political speaking points and what the court's actually saying and what's actually happening on the ground. And the best way to do that is to link up to the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society website. They have all the background on the case. They have press releases about court decisions as they come out, and they're keeping us all informed on an updated basis. And even more than that, they have multiple ways in which you can help. And it'll be resources like this that help us weed through the noise on social media and mainstream media and know what the truth is. So Canada will likely try to continue to distract people, talk about the separate class action, or talk about what their intentions are, which won't reflect what is all is in their written legal submissions. It's important to keep focused on the core aspects of this case. The two most important things you need to know about this case are, one, that Canada continues to racially discriminate against First Nations kids in foster care and their families by providing less funding than they are entitled to, and two, that Canada is acting like an outlaw. It is failing to abide by its own rule of law and failing to fully comply with all of the orders and the compensation order of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to the victims of their racial discrimination. It is as simple and as devastating as that. All of the other issues that are raised are just distractions by those politicians. What we know statistically is that for the most part, First Nations children in foster care don't tend to fare very well. They have higher rates of homelessness, they have higher rates of suicide, higher rates of physical and mental health issues, they have less education rates. Their life opportunities tend to be more diminished from being in foster care. And we also know from the National Inquiry into Murder to Missing Indigenous Women and Girls that foster care is actually a pipeline to murder to missing Indigenous women and girls, to being exploited, abused, a victim of human trafficking. It's also a pipeline into youth corrections and later adult corrections. Now, there are always exceptions. However, you cannot argue with the statistics. We know that the majority of circumstances where First Nations children are put into foster care or into adoptions outside of their own families, those situations break down by the age of 16. The vast majority. So what we are doing is not helping First Nations children. We're making their situation worse. And that doesn't even speak to the profound and negative and devastating impacts on the First Nations moms who have their children taken away from them. Moms alone suffer higher rates of heart attack, stroke, mental illness, depression, anxiety, and suicide when they have had their kids taken away from them. And then think about all of the dads and the grandparents and the communities, the loss to these communities, the loss of connection to culture, the loss of our community members. All of it is devastating all the way around. Canada owes these children, and $40,000 isn't even near enough to compensate for lost childhoods or lost lives. But at a minimum, it shouldn't even be a question they should be complying with this order. And here's the thing, it's never too late. They have the funding, they have the power, they have all of it to make the decision today to end this battle against First Nations children in care. They just need to do it. But this is where we need all of you. We need all of you First Nations and Canadians working together, helping us push the government in the right direction. We need you to self-educate. That's an important part of reconciliation, but not just education for informational purposes. We need you to self-educate and know about this case so that you can take action. And if you go to the First Nation Child and Family Caring website, they will have 7 free ways that you can help. You can write letters, you can sign petitions, you can donate, you can do lots of things, many of which don't even cost any money. The key here is we are all implicated in the ongoing genocide that's happening on Turtle Island. The National Inquiry into Murder to Missing Indigenous Women and Girls was very specific about that. It's not just governments who need to act, it's also Canadians who benefit from ongoing genocidal acts against our people. And if you can go to their website, the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society, and do some of these free things, that'll help push the government in the right direction because they need to hear from you. And before I end this video, I have a message for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, for Minister Carolyn Bennett, and for Minister Mark Miller. Stop this. Can you just please stop this? You know what you're doing. You know that it is wrong. You know it's against the law. And worse, you know through all of your own analysis, research, documentation, and statistics what happens to our kids when they are overrepresented in foster care. And that is on you. That is not on us. There is no deficiency in us. It is entirely on you. It's a legacy of residential schools, but it's also a part of ongoing genocide. That's by your direction, your laws, policies, and practices. You have the power, you have all of our wealth, you have the entire ability to stop this right now. So please, stop this fight against First Nations kids in care. Why don't you stand up as a real government representing all Canadians and all human rights and all treaty rights, including First Nations, and put an end to this?